There are always people who push the boundaries in the auto industry. Christian von Koenigsegg, Elon Musk, but one of them has a history not dating back to the turn of the century. I'm talking about dating back to the previous turn of the century. And there's only one man for that then, Ettore Bugatti.
Absolutely not.
In a family full of artists, sculptors, and designers, how would a young Ettore Bugatti stand out? Well, he took his artistic skills and turned them to the engineering world by starting work at a local quadricycle manufacturer, where he used his motor vehicle knowledge to build the Bugatti Type 1. And it was weird even for 1899 standards. For one, the tricycle had two engines, one for each wheel, and it was designed for one thing: racing. He entered into a 90-kilometer endurance race in France, and the 17-year-old newbie on a tricycle beat everybody, including the eventual founders of Fiat. And he then won a further 2 races with it before moving on to a 4-wheeled version called the Type 2. That got Ettore in the sights of Laurent Dietsch, who funded Types 3 through 7. These licensed Bugattis were genuine production cars, too, with around 100 6s and 7s being produced between 1902 and 1904, which is a lot for the early days of motoring. Remember, the Model T hadn't been invented yet. That didn't matter, though, to Ettore, because he moved over to Deutsch Engine Builders to create the Type 10, before parting ways shortly after that to create his own car company, Bugatti. The 1910 Type 13 was arguably the first proper Bugatti that they made. It had a revolutionary 1.4-liter 4-valve per head engine developing 30 horsepower. Not a lot, but the car, air quotes, weighed less than 700 pounds, and it was easily one of the best handling cars of the era. Not saying much, given, the early years of motoring, but still, it was very impressive. And at 77 mile-an-hour top speed, was down on its competitors. But have you seen the Type 13? Safety is not very high on its priority list. If you crashed at more than 20 in this thing, you would probably die. But it worked. Bugatti made various tweaks to the Type 13 over the coming years, like new styling and longer wheelbases, as the money began to flow in. That allowed him to focus on his true passion, a passion he's been pursuing since the Type 1, racing. The Type 16 or 5-liter Bugatti was their first factory racer. The 100 horsepower 5-liter 4-cylinder wasn't very fast, and a great irony, the Bugattis were usually 20 to 25 kilometers an hour slower down the straightaways than their rivals, Peugeot. Yeah, there's a weird sentence you'll never hear today. Hey, did you know that Peugeot beat a Bugatti in a drag race? Yeah. It was a very advanced car, even with the chain-driven rear axle, because of its leaf spring suspension setup. But the straight-line speed was simply too much of a disadvantage, and none of the 5 cars produced had any racing success. And Bugatti clearly didn't learn from their mistakes and made the Type 32, which had yet another substandard engine attached to a fantastic chassis. This time it was a 90 horsepower straight 8, attached to a pioneering 3-speed gearbox and reverse transaxle. It was built solely to compete in the 1923 French Grand Prix, and only 1 out of the 4 cars finished. But at least it finished on a podium at 3rd place, so not great, not terrible. Bugatti would have to wait for success until their next race car, the 35. Technically, it was Bugatti's first mass production car, with 340 made in 7 years. And of those 340, there were 8 different versions, including the 37 and the 39. I know they have different numbers, but as we'll see later on, they stem from the same origin point. So the 37 and 39, for instance, both stem from the 35. So they're under the 35's umbrella. Anyway, they're pretty much the same. They're just tweaked for different races. And we're going to simplify it to the 35 because over its career, the 35 scored 351 Grand Prix victories, single-handedly rewriting the record book by setting 47 records in just 2 years. But that was just child's play compared to the rest of its illustrious career. Versions of the 35 won over 2,000 races in its day. At its peak, the 35 was winning 14 per week. But how? Well, the good old Bugatti handling. While every other car in the group was focused on pure raw horsepower, the 35 just had 140 at its peak. But it didn't matter, because it also had a hollow front axle and cast aluminum wheels to keep the weight down and improve the handling. And the front wheels were at a ridiculous, comical amount of camber to increase the contact patch as the car turned around a corner. And it had pioneering drum brakes to get it stopped. It was a true legend of the auto industry that has not been rivaled to this day. No other vehicle before or since, even the 911, can really rival what the 35 did. The 911 may have won more races, but it competed for 60 years, almost 10 times longer than the Type 35. It's arguably Bugatti's high watermark. I know there are technological advancements later on, there are luxury cars later on, but for me, the 35 will always be the highlight of the Bugatti career. It was just so game-changing for the racing industry. The same cannot be said for the Type 51 class, because after the dominance of the 35 wound down, they replaced it with the more powerful Type 51/54/59. The 35 made no more than 140 horsepower, but the Type 51 started at 160 and evolved all the way up to a 300 horsepower dual overhead cam 4.9 liters straight 8. In theory, it would have combined the handling of the 35 with a massive power boost. Unfortunately for Bugatti, they were going up against well-funded Italian teams by Mussolini and the well-funded German teams from Adolf Hitler. And they were simply outspent, only winning a few Grand Prix. Bugatti needed to change the formula in order to achieve success, and they aimed their sights at the greatest race for any Frenchman, the race they have never won, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The pinnacle of French racing had been dominated by high-horsepower Alfa Romeos and Bentleys, the latter of which Ed Ray called the world's fastest lorries, because of their boxy shape, heavy weight, but massive horsepower figures for the Mulsanne Straights. So Bugatti took a page out of their playbook. They built a Type 57 road car, boosted power to nearly 500 horsepower, and then in a different move, they took the body off and replaced it with a super streamlined tank body style. That's what was his nickname, the Type 57 tank. And finally, after 13 Le Mans efforts, Bugatti achieved an overall victory in 1937 and 1939, and that was Bugatti's last racing hurrah. The Type 50 and the Type 53 never really achieved success, even with the 53's innovative all-wheel drive system, and their final race of the 251 never even finished the only race it entered. So after that slightly depressing end, let's go back to the road cars. You see, after the 13 was successful, Ed Ray built the 4-cylinder follow-up, the Type 18, and then he built their first 8-cylinder road car, the Type 30, and with over 3,000 versions sold in 12 years, it was incredibly popular, and incredibly fast. The Type 43 version of the Type 30 had a supercharged 2.3-liter engine from the famed Type 35 Grand Prix racer. That made the 43 the first production car to hit 100 miles an hour in 1927. And that year was rather important because one car, released in 1927, changed Bugatti's direction forever. The Type 41, or the Royale. In the ultimate power move, apparently some British girl said Bugatti's cars are nothing compared to Rolls-Royces, so Ed Ray set out to build the most luxurious car the world had ever seen. And you couldn't miss it. At 252 inches long, 83 inches wide, and a curb weight of nearly 7,000 pounds, it's one of the largest cars in history. But it was also a Bugatti, and Ed Ray made sure it could still be sporty. The 12.7-liter straight 8 made 300 horsepower and 875 foot-pounds of torque, which meant even the heavy barn like that did 125 miles an hour. And it wasn't that bad either in the handling department, all things considered. With a clutch and gearbox mounted to the chassis, instead of the engine to act as stress members and reduce cabin noise. Bugatti only planned to make 25 of them and sell them to royal families only, hence the name. He went as far as to say, "This year King Alfonso of Spain will receive his Royale." And then immediately after the King Alfonso of Spain was deposed from power. And that pretty much sums up the Royale as a car. Out of the 25 planned, only 7 were made, 3 of them were sold, and none of them went to royalty. And only 6 of those survive today, which is nothing short of a miracle, because when the Nazis invaded France, Bugatti hid the cars wherever they could. Some were buried in the ground, some were hidden behind brick walls, stored in Paris's sewers, and one was shipped to the US, found in a scrapyard and bought for $75 to avoid being crushed. That man made a very good investment, because nowadays they're valued at roughly $10 million. So it was a colossal failure, but Bugatti didn't give up on that whole luxury car idea. I mean, sure, they made the Type 55 Roadster in 1932, but the Royale marked a turning point in the brand. The Type 57, which the racing version I mentioned earlier was based on, is simply put it, one of the most beautiful cars ever made, and it had a 3.3-liter inline 8, making 135 horsepower. It was as fast as some Grand Prix cars of the era. And they even made a performance version called the 57T and the 57SC, boasting a supercharged engine with 200 horsepower and a top speed north of 120. But Bugatti's magnum opus was on the horizon, the Atlantic Coupe. Tragically named after his friend whose plane crashed in the Atlantic Ocean, it was a sleek design. And these cars also experienced troubled pasts due to the Nazis. However, they're so rare and so valuable that every single chassis, surviving or not, has been tracked fully throughout its history. So we have chassis 57473, which had its owners executed by the Nazis before it bounced around Europe for a few decades before getting hit by a train. Then it got rebuilt and is now considered nothing more than a good replica. Oh, that makes me sad. Moving on from that slight tragedy, chassis 57374 fared much better, being abandoned in a French field in 1941 and getting bought for $30 million by the Moulin Auto Museum. Chassis 57591 also led the good life, being evacuated from France in 1939 before eventually being bought by Ralph Lauren. And chassis 57502 was abandoned in a barn for 48 years, discovered by the guy's nephew, and was sold for a record $10.4 million in barn-find condition. But as I sort of hinted at, unlike the Royale, a few did not see the end of the war. For instance, chassis 57331 was disassembled by Bugatti themselves in 1936 because they didn't see a point of it and it was taking up space. Yeah, Bugatti disassembled one of their own Type 57 Atlantic coupes just because it was filling stuff up. Wow, times have changed. And then there's chassis 57453. Considered by Jean Bugatti his greatest achievement, Lavoie Noir, as it was called, or the Black Car, was the only 57C fitted with a factory supercharger. It was a gift to Bugatti racing driver Robert Benoist for winning the Le Mans with them in 1937. And then the trail starts to go cold. In 1940, it's documented that all of the Bugatti family and the racing driver Robert Benoist fled the invading Germans, and that the car was to be sent by train to Bordeaux in 1941. After that, it was never seen again. And trying to track it down is virtually impossible since the car was never registered to anybody, even Jane. Provided the car is just buried in the ground or in a barn to avoid the Nazis and wasn't destroyed in the war, it's one of, if not the, most valuable cars in the world, with an estimated value of $115 million. But the time was not long for Bugatti in France because they only made one more production car after the war, the Type 101. Only 8 were made, 3 coupes, 4 cabriolets, and 1 sedan. And then they shut their doors for good in 1963. You see, the deaths of Jean in 1939 and Ettore in 1947 were wounds the company never fully recovered from. even side projects like the Type 52 and Type 56 electric cars, a rail car, and the 100p racing plane. The company was simply doomed, and it wouldn't come back until 1987, and by then, it wasn't French. You see, an Italian businessman named Romano Artoli bought Bugatti in 1987 and began working on their new car, the Ettore Bugatti 110. You see, the EB110 was styled by Lamborghini technical director Paolo Stanzi, and development was overseen by Ferrari chief engineer Nicola Materazzi, who oversaw the Testarossa, 288 GTO, and the F40. That is a hell of a lineup, and what they came up with was a 3.5-liter quad-turbocharged V12 mounted to a carbon fiber chassis with all-wheel drive and active aero for controllability. This was big stuff in 1991, and it shocked everybody. And if 502 slightly turbo-laggy horsepower wasn't enough for you, you could get the lighter, even laggier, and more powerful Super Sport version. With a top speed of 218 miles an hour, it was, simply put it, the fastest car in the world. But it didn't matter. You see, poor spending by the owner and a fresh recession meant Bugatti Automobile SPA went bust just 4 years later. The EB110, though, that carried on. The remaining chassis were bought by German tuner Dower, who made the EB110 SS lightweight. And thanks to advancements in technology, the turbo lag was reduced, power was shot up to 705 horsepower, and 500 pounds were removed from the weight. That's a seriously impressive figure even by today's standards. Now the top speed was 230 and the standing kilometer was done in 19 seconds. And the overall design, the engineering side of the EB110, was sold to B Engineering, who can still make the Adonis, as they call it, today, albeit with a twin-turbo setup and rear-wheel drive. But there would be another long hiatus for the better part of a decade, until Volkswagen bought the failing company in 1998, and pretty soon they commissioned Italo-Design to come up with some ideas for a new Bugatti. First there was the EB118 Coupe, then the EB218 Sedan, and then the 18-3 Chiron. All of them had the world's first W-shaped engine with 18 cylinders making 560 horsepower. But none of them went through. In fact, it wasn't until Volkswagen's own concept, the EB18-4, that designs began to progress. And the concept was almost identical to their first road car, the Veyron EB16-4. Veyron, of course, named after Bugatti's racing driver Pierre Veyron, who won Le Mans in 1939 for them. And then EB for Ettore, and 16.4 because of the engine. No, it was not an 18-cylinder monster. Rather, it was a much smaller 8-liter, 16-cylinder quad-turbocharged monster that was, simply put it, a piece of pure engineering genius. Even Volkswagen admit that the W16 is not the most efficient engine. They just did it to see if it could be done. And the result shattered the record books. 987 horsepower made it the most powerful production car ever, and the top speed of 254 miles an hour made it the fastest production car in the world and the first car to exceed the 400 km/h barrier. The active aero system allowed for either VMAX top speed driving or a handling mode, which could generate 700 pounds of downforce. That's a lot of car, which is good because it costs a lot of money. I mean, the base price was $1 million out of the box. You want a new transmission, that's $120,000. New tires, that's a $25,000 set, plus $70,000 in service bills for your troubles. Now here's the thing about this new Bugatti. They really like special editions. There are dozens of limited run or one-off versions that are nothing but a coat of paint, which is why we're only going to focus on the SS model of the Veyron, the Super Sports up-power up to 1,184 horsepower, and featured a more streamlined yet subtle body changes to reduce drag, which meant at Volkswagen's Oval testing facility, the Veyron SS hit a two-way average of 267.86 miles an hour, reclaiming the title as the world's fastest production car. But don't think of it as a really fancy American dragster that can only go in a straight line. because it also broke Top Gear's test track lap record, showing that it could keep up around the corners despite its curb weight, and then decimate anything down the straightaways. But let's be real. The Veyron isn't going to do any of these things. Sure, it can do them, but if you're rich enough for a Veyron, all you're going to do is cruise around town so that everybody can see what you've bought. That's why it's got leather and diamonds covering the interior, and why it's essentially the fastest luxury hotel on the planet. No, the most important thing about the Veyron isn't what it did, it's what it showed that it can do. It was a technological masterpiece that changed the auto industry forever and made the word hypercar a common phrase. Of course, when you have a car that impressive, how do you top it? Well, the original plan was to turn that brutal engineering mindset onto a sedan called the 16C Gabalier. But that project fizzled out and they began work on a Veyron successor called the Chiron. It had a brand new carbon fiber chassis and new bodywork to fit around an engine that is basically a redesigned version of the Veyron SS's W16-4. Now the 8-liter monster went from 1,200 horsepower to 1,500 horsepower and 1,200 foot-pounds of torque. It's the fastest gasoline-powered vehicle ever in the quarter mile, doing it in just 9.4 seconds at 158 miles an hour. Its top speed in the quarter mile is faster than the top speed of a Mustang GT at any mile, which is kind of insane. But that quarter mile trap speed is nothing compared to the top speed of 261 miles an hour? Turns out, due to limits in tire technology at the time, it was electronically limited, until the technology for the tires caught up enough to reach those higher speeds. And when those tires did come out, they were fitted to the SS 300 Plus in 2019, now up to 1,580 horsepower, and sporting an ultra-streamlined long tail. It had one goal: break the 300 mile per hour barrier in a road car. And on August 2nd, 2019, test driver Andy Wallace hit 304.77 miles an hour in a pre-production 300 Plus at Volkswagen's Oval test track. Although it is worth noting that the production cars are limited to a measly 271 miles an hour, but Volkswagen will take the limiter off if you're at their fancy oval track. So far, 300 out of the 500 Chirons have been made at $2.4 million a pop, and like the Veyron, there are quite a few special editions that are nothing more than a coat of paint. But there are some unique ones that I'm going to touch on. First, there's the Chiron Lavoie Noir, which is a homage to the lost Type 57 Atlantic I mentioned earlier, and it's tuned to be a more relaxing experience than the normal Chiron, if you can call an $18.9 million 8-liter W16 hypercar relaxed. Then there's the Centodieci, which is a much cheaper car, only $9 million. It's also a Chiron SS underneath, but the body is sought after the EB110 to celebrate Bugatti's 110th birthday. And then we have the Divo, the most radical change to the Chiron by far, thanks to its emphasis on handling rather than top speed. It's got a massive active rear wing, making up to 1,000 pounds of downforce, and laps Naruto's handling track 8 seconds faster than a normal Chiron. Now, the added drag does mean that its combined MPG of 10 is the worst in recorded US history, but spending $5 million on one of 40 Bugatti track cars, I don't think you really care. But out of all the Chiron special editions, my absolute favorite by a mile is the 1-to-1 scale Lego Technic Chiron. It actually moves, I'm not making it up. It has 2,300 Lego power motors, making a combined 5.4 horsepower and 68 torque. It makes more torque than some economy cars, and it's made out of like 90% Lego. It has a top speed verified of 12 miles an hour, and it's technically Bugatti's first electric car since 1930. Pretty damn sweet. but their maddest car has yet to be released. It's called the Bolide. It was devised entirely on a computer, and then they thought, what if we actually build it? It's a track-only version that runs on 98-octane fuel, making 1,600 horsepower. But the difference between the Bolide and the Chiron is the aerodynamics and the body style. The Bolide is half a ton lighter than the Chiron and features ridiculous bodywork based on the Bell X-1 aircraft, the first aircraft to break the speed of sound. It generates 5,800 pounds of downforce at 200 miles an hour, and if the computer sims are accurate, it could hypothetically lap the Nürburgring faster than the current 919 Evo record holder from Porsche. I don't really believe that, because the numbers are simply hilarious. So we'll have to see how truthful that thing really is. But we might not have to wait that long, because Bugatti's future is actually pretty sound. In 2020, Bugatti made a profit for the third year in a row, and their production is still going strong. And clearly they're doing something right, because the innovative Croatian car company Rimac just purchased a 55% stock stake in Bugatti in 2021. And finally, Bugatti has decided to split off its one-offs for the Chiron and the Veyron. I keep clamoring on about how useless they are. They finally split that off into its own division called the Sur Mesure in 2021 as well, just to make sure that every single customer gets exactly what they want. I have never been the biggest fan of Bugatti, despite my past with their name, but they're an incredible car company. My inner engineer thinks they're one of the best, only rivaling them as Porsche and Koenigsegg in my mind. They love to push the boundaries of what is possible in the automotive landscape, and although I don't believe the Bolide can do what it says it can do, they've proven people wrong before. Let's see if they improve people wrong this time too.